First question, after this wrap about the experience in Bahrain, we're talking about the big disruptive moment that education faced. You are into academics, so we want this big hat that you wear to tell us and to think with us about disruption. So what does disruption, COVID disruption, mean for education? Is it simply the fact that we just went online? Is that it? Is this the changing factor, the turning point that education as a sector, as an industry is going through?
Can I go there?
Or you can take the question from here.
I'll
Sure.
do it there, thank you. Morning, everybody. My name is Jalal Azin. I am a professor at the University of Tunis Al Manar, and I am the founding chairholder of the UNESCO Chair on Science, Technology, and Innovation Policy. And today I will be sharing with you some ideas about what could be or what are the key questions that will allow us to think about a new model of education. Of course, everybody is thinking about these issues, and it's not a new question, it's quite an old one. But I am very happy today to be among you to talk and exchange ideas about these strategic issues, not for just our countries, but for our humanity as a whole. And as Lynn just asked, of course, COVID-19 somehow threw all of us, into this e-learning paradigm, and we had to really adapt to it and discover it by doing and adapting to it so that we can fulfill our mission the best possible. However, I would like to really, go back a little bit to education as a question from a philosophical, from a socio-economic, as well as an economic issue. So the questions I would be asking is, education for what? What is the purpose of education? The other question would be, for whom? Okay? Is it just for people who are only 5 to 22 years old, or for everybody? And the other and the last question would be, with what and how? And that's really what brings us to this situation. Let me frame this talk and try to somehow talk about key issues that humanity is facing. Today, humanity is facing really existential threats, okay? And these existential threats go from global warming to pandemics and all the way, of course, to ecosystem collapse. As a matter of fact, 10 days ago, I was in Bahrain, intervening in a panel talking about AI and the energy transition. And that's a very, very important issue. And the first thing I said was, if you expect me to say that AI is going to save us from global warming, I am not going to tell you that. Because AI is definitely necessary, but far, far from being sufficient. I would say the same thing to you here. Not about AI and global warming, but about education and distance education, or e-learning. E-learning is very important. E-learning is with us and will be with us for a long time. However, if we want a new model of education, e-learning by itself will not make it. So this reminds me of the cinema. Remember, the early days of the cinema, cinema just was reduced to going, taping plays, and then replaying the same play for some other people somewhere else. So there was nothing really brought in, by the cinema. But today we all know how cinema has changed so much that we all talk about Hollywood, Bollywood, and what have you, and it became an art in itself. So today, maybe we are really making our first steps really in e-learning and distance learning. And in 10, 20, or 30 years, and with the metaverse, which is really creeping in us, things would change tremendously. So fundamental questions are a must, and they have to be asked, and we need to seek answers. I will not give you answers, but I will just share with you some thoughts. So as I said, if global warming, pandemics, as well as ecosystem collapse is what humanity is facing, that tells me one thing, or tells us one thing, that our education system has failed. Okay? If humanity today is facing existential threats, that means education has failed. Or us, grown-ups, professors, and those who are designing policies have failed. Okay? So how can we redesign this model so that we can really save humanity from itself and come up with a new model or models of education? So what I'm trying to say is somehow education is really the mother of crisis, okay? And we need to come up with something new. But before doing that, I would like to talk with you very quickly about an experience as a professor that I lived with my students, in my university, okay? When we were thrown into this, e-learning paradigm, and we had to do it very, very quickly and adapt with it and, manage with whatever means we had. I must tell you that I was really happy with that experience to a high extent. That means it was really an abrupt kind of a crisis. We went into it without much preparation, but we succeeded to a high extent. But we didn't succeed because it was only e-learning and because we had the internet and whatever, computers and whatever goes with it. It's also because we experimented with different pedagogies, okay? So, but even though this experience was positive, I must insist on the fact that that same experience had also lesser happy endings, and that's mainly for the poor students who are in the rural areas without networks and maybe without access to computers. These students had great difficulties really living this new experience of the COVID and trying to really to catch up with their studies. So what made me really happy about this experience? Because during this COVID experience, we made sure to change, the role of the professor. And this is one of the key elements that we have to bring into the picture when we are talking and thinking about a new model of education. Let's not forget that, information today is so humongous that humanity is really facing a tsunami of information. But be careful. Information is not knowledge, okay? Just to give you a couple of numbers and indicators. In 2016, humanity produced in 1 year as much information as humanity produced since the beginning, since we knew of humanity. And I read lately in Nature, I believe, that the information produced on the internet in 1 day will take any one of us 64 years to kind of browse and go through. And that shows you how much information we have, and we need to deal with it. While it is really positive, but it has also its very, very challenging issues. So the idea here is to really go from a sage on the stage to a guide on the side. So the professor has to change the way he teaches. The professor should stop from inculcating information to his students, from being a coach, from being a mentor, from being, a coach that helps his students acquire knowledge. And that is through, learning by doing and by developing critical thinking. Unfortunately, our education systems today, all over the world, because remember, this education system was put together to respond to the industrial revolutions, okay? And it was basically a Fordist kind of education. That education is no longer, what we need to save humanity from itself. And also, I remind you that right after the Second War, in the United States, we came up with this concept, which is called human capital development. So students were thought of as capital that we had to develop and consequently look for return on investment. And that's really a very liberal capitalistic way of looking at students, which is, I believe, not acceptable at all. For a student is not a capital. A student is a capacity. A student is a potential. And education has to be there to bring out all that potential these students have so that we prepare them for our, highly changing societies. So somehow, education today, the way we practice it, is really in contradiction with our times. How is that? I mean, people who are as old as I am, have worked with computers where the operating system was DOS. Okay, I'm talking to people with white hair like me here. So we saw DOS, and then came Windows 3.1, and that was a big deal. And today we have Windows 10 and Windows 11. If you show one of the youngsters sitting with us here, show them DOS or show them Windows 3.1 and tell them that's really how Windows 11 was, they would say, no, that can't be. And that's very meaningful. That means technology is changing so rapidly that by the time you go to school and you get whatever schooling, during 4 or 5 years and walk out, the material, the education you received would be obsolete. So that's a big, big challenge. How can education adapt itself to this highly changing, world with its information, with its technologies, and with its existential threats? So education has to change, okay? So what are the key elements that the new education system must have so that we can prepare, people for the 21st century? The first thing, which is very important, is have critical thinking. How to teach, how to train students to be critical thinkers. Because with the tsunami of information, okay, if you are not a critical thinker, you might take anything as being truth. And we really know that today people who are on Facebook, Instagram, and what have you, that there is much, much less truth than probably truth. So that's one thing. The second one, we need to learn by doing. Students need to learn by doing. We cannot continue having professors, inculcating to his pupils his knowledge. But we need to have students learning by doing. The third element, which is probably the most important one, students have to learn how to learn. So with critical thinking, learning by doing, and learning how to learn, we might be able to prepare the future citizens so that they can cope with a highly dynamic, changing world. And here I would like to really insist on something, which is coming up with a model of education, even though here I am giving you some elements, is very, very difficult, and it's not going to be for tomorrow that we get really the right model. So I wanted to embark you with me in some kind of an exercise, which is a foresight exercise, because we won't be able to come up with the right model of education if we don't know what kind of education we need and for what kind of world, okay? So to do this simple and quick foresight exercise, I'm gonna take 2 dimensions, okay, which are highly uncertain, okay? The first dimension is actually technology, okay? What is the uncertainty about technology? There are 2 antipodes. The first ones, are we going to be the masters of technology, or are we going to be slaves to technology? I mind you that today, we are being more of slaves rather than masters. As a matter of fact, today, AI, is a big threat for humanity, for it could be, a technology that might really represent existential threats to us who really, came up with this technology. So are we going to be the masters, or are we going to be slaves for technology? The second one is an eco-social, an environmental dimension, which I will reduce it to 2 elements. Are we going to keep living by having more and more, or are we living by being? And this reminds me a book, actually. I got these 2 terminology from Eric Fromm, who's a psychoanalyst who wrote this book in the 60s. And this book title is To Have or To Be. These are fundamental questions. Are we going to keep having, or are we going to change this having into being so that we can face our existential threats and save humanity from itself? So, of course, if we're going to be masters and we're going to be really being rather than having, that is really the word I think we all will be looking for. The antipode to that would be that we will be slaves to technology, and we would like to have more. And to me, that's really a big dystopia, something that you might call, Mad Max. Those who saw the movie will get an idea of what we are expecting. The third one would be being masters of technology, but still wanting more, okay? That's, I would call that the fortress word. That means a word that will exacerbate inequalities between people, countries, and regions, and consequently produce more conflicts, more war, and more threats. And I'll finish with this last scenario. And to tell you the truth, I tried to come up with a title or a name or a tag for this scenario. I couldn't, So I'm gonna, beg you, help me with this scenario to see if we can come up with, a title or a name for this one, where we will be slaves to technology. That means technology will be running the show, and we will really strive for well-being. Could we really imagine such word? Could we be striving for more well-being and at the same time being slaves to technology? To me, it's really so unexpected, so, how would I say it, crazy idea that I couldn't come up really with a title. But I'll leave you with this try, which is we will end up, I believe, what I call tech zombies. So technology will be the masters. We will be living very happy. We would think that we are living happily, but the AI is running the show. Would you like to be in that world? Thank you very much.
So, okay, so all of that is... I think they just did.
No, you're still there. So am I.
They're on. The microphone is on.
Test, test, test. Okay, voilà. Thank you so much, Professor.
I just heard myself on there.
The last thought was a bit scary, but it's definitely something to think of. So thank you for leaving us with these thoughts, and thank you for taking us into like a fundamental maybe ride to re-explore how or what are the pillars on which new models of education will be built. I want to move now to our entrepreneur on the stage. Obviously, COVID is one of the big disruptive moments of education, but as our panelists have already mentioned, this was not and will not be the only case, pandemics, and we will have way more moments. I want to talk to you about what you work on, because you cover, from your experience first as a human development expert, how you landed on a niche kind of education that is part of new models of the new, like with capital letters, the new education, right? We're talking here about the early childhood education. So yes, digital, yes, technology, yes, obviously revisiting the disciplines that are being taught, but also new periods or new stages of education, which is something you specialize in. So can you tell us about this field?
Absolutely. Thank you, Lynn. For over a decade, I was advising governments, private sector, and nonprofit organizations on designing programs that provide access to education to children and youth to upskill human potential and human capacity. And if we look at providing education, you say, what does it mean, to whom, and how? We realize that even a 5-year-old can be disadvantaged at entering school. And throughout my thesis and Master's in Public Administration and Designing Policies, I looked at existing models. In the OECD countries, they introduced a standardized test called PISA to evaluate the standard of education of a country. In 2001, Germany ranked below average on the PISA, and there's a research by the OECD that is called the German PISA shock. And this is a shock to a country like Germany, which is a pioneer